The chamber of the Galactic Ruling Council had not changed in 12,000 years, and that was exactly the way its masters preferred it. Carved from the bones of a dead moon, and suspended in the gravitational sweet spot between three ancient stars, Aethara Prime was more than a space station. It was a monument to permanence, a temple to the idea that some civilizations were simply meant to rule, and others were meant to kneel. 12 species sat in that chamber, each one older than most stars in the outer rim, each one convinced of its own superiority, and all of them united by a single unshakable belief: the galaxy had an order, and they were at the top of it. High Arbiter Zaloon Varathi of the Draelith hegemony stood at the central podium, his tall insectoid frame draped in ceremonial silk that shimmered with bioluminescent thread, and he looked out across the assembled representatives with the calm confidence of someone who had never once in his long life been told he was wrong. "Fellow members of the conclave," he began, his mandibles clicking softly between words, "I bring before you a matter of galactic security that can no longer be ignored." He gestured, and a holographic star map bloomed into existence above the chamber, thousands of systems glowing in soft blue light. And then a spreading stain of red crept across the display like a wound that refused to heal. 300 years, Zaloon said, letting the number hang in the air like an accusation. "That is all the time this species has had, since they crawled off their death world and touched their first star. And in that insignificant sliver of cosmic time, they have spread across 412 systems." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Ambassador Keth of the Morhani Collective leaned forward, her gelatinous form quivering with what might have been concern or might have been irritation. 412, she repeated. "That cannot be accurate." "It is not only accurate," Zaloon replied. "It is already outdated, because by the time this session concludes, they will likely have claimed another 3. He let the hologram rotate slowly, the red stain pulsing like a heartbeat. "They call themselves humans," he continued, "and they are everything this conclave was created to prevent. Chaotic, aggressive, unpredictable, and expanding at a rate that makes every growth model we have ever developed completely useless." The Draelith High Arbiter moved away from the podium and walked among the seated delegates, his clawed feet clicking against the ancient stone floor. "We have attempted integration," he said. "They refused, and they did not refuse politely. They told our diplomatic envoy that they would rather, and I am quoting their ambassador directly here, eat glass than take orders from a committee of fossils who haven't had an original idea since before our species learned to walk upright." A shocked silence fell across the chamber, because no species in 40,000 years had spoken to the conclave that way and lived to repeat the insult. Zaloon returned to the podium, and his voice dropped to something low and sharp. "I propose the subjugation mandate," he said. "A full and coordinated campaign, military, economic, and political, to strip this species of its sovereignty and reclassify them as a dependent civilization under conclave oversight. And I propose we do it now, before they become something we cannot control." The debate that followed lasted 9 hours, though in truth the outcome was never really in question. Representative after representative rose to speak, and most of them said the same thing in different ways. Humanity was young. Humanity was arrogant. Humanity did not understand how the galaxy worked. And it was the conclave's duty, no, its sacred obligation, to teach them. The Thessari representatives spoke of stability and the importance of maintaining the balance of power that had kept the galaxy peaceful for millennia, conveniently forgetting the 17 species the conclave had crushed into dust to maintain that so-called peace. The Urvani delegate spoke of cultural preservation and the danger of allowing an unregulated species to contaminate the galactic community with their primitive ideas, as though ideas were a disease and curiosity was a symptom. The brilliant ambassador spoke of military necessity and the tactical danger of allowing a Death World species to continue developing weapons technology without supervision. And this argument carried the most weight, because fear was always the Conclave's most reliable currency. Only one delegate did not speak. The Valesi ambassador sat in the farthest seat, a being so ancient that even the other elder species treated it with something close to reverence. Throughout the entire 9 hours of debate, it said nothing at all. It simply watched with those deep black eyes that seemed to hold the memory of every mistake the galaxy had ever made. When the vote was called, Zeluan read the motion aloud in the formal tongue of the conclave, and one by one the representatives cast their decisions. 11 voted in favor. The Valesi abstained. Zeluan turned to the ancient ambassador with barely concealed irritation. The Valesi declined to participate, he said, as they have declined to participate in every significant decision for the last 8,000 years. Will your people at least offer a reason this time? The Valesi ambassador rose slowly from its seat, and when it spoke, its voice was like wind moving through a canyon that had existed since before the first sun was born. You count their years, the Valesi said, and you see a young species. You count their systems, and you see a growing threat. You do not count the right things. Zeluan's mandibles twitched. And what should we be counting? Their wars, the Valesi replied, and then it sat back down and said nothing more. The chamber dismissed the words as the ramblings of an ancient species that had long since lost its relevance, and the conclave moved forward with the efficiency of an institution that had been crushing civilizations since before most of the galaxy's current stars had finished forming. Within 6 hours the ultimatum was drafted. Humanity would disarm, dissolve its parliament, and submit to species reclassification within 90 standard days, or face the combined military force of the 12 most powerful civilizations in existence. Within 12 hours the ultimatum was transmitted across every frequency the conclave controlled. Within 24 hours, monuments were commissioned to commemorate the decision, because the conclave always built monuments to its victories. Before the fighting even started, it saved time, and it sent a message. They called the operation the Correction, and they recorded it in the great archives of Aethara Prime as a historic moment in galactic governance, a necessary step taken by wise and ancient hands to preserve the order of things. On Earth, the ultimatum arrived on a Tuesday. Fleet Admiral Rena Okafor read it aloud in the Situation Room of the United Stellar Commonwealth's High Command, surrounded by officers who had been preparing for exactly this moment for longer than the conclave would have believed possible. When she finished reading, the room was silent. She set the datapad down on the table and looked at the faces around her. Soldiers, strategists, veterans of a dozen conflicts across 100 worlds, and she saw the same expression on every single one of them. Not fear, not surprise, not even anger. It was the expression of people who had been waiting for it. Fight! And had just been told exactly when and where it would happen. They gave us 90 days, Admiral Okafor said quietly. They really do not know what a deadline means to us, do they? She picked up the datapad again and handed it to her chief of staff. Send the response, she said. The response was 2 words long. It was not polite. And somewhere in the farthest seat of the conclave chamber, the Valesi ambassador closed those ancient black eyes and whispered to no one in particular, "It begins." The conclave's war machine had not been fully activated in over 6,000 years, and it showed, not in rust or decay, but in something far more dangerous, absolute confidence. 90,000 warships launched from staging grounds across 12 empires, organized into 3 massive invasion fleets designated Spear, Hammer, and Crown. Each one commanded by an admiral who had studied warfare from textbooks written before humanity's home planet had developed agriculture. The strategy was simple, because the Conclave believed simple was all that was required. Spear would hit humanity's industrial colonies along the border and cripple their production capacity. Hammer would blockade their major trade routes and strangle their economy. And Crown would drive straight for Earth itself and force a surrender before the species had time to understand what was happening to them. It was a strategy that had worked against the Tenevari 8,000 years ago, and against the Shoari before them, and against 11 other species whose names had been reduced to footnotes in Conclave history books. High Arbiter Zeluin watched the fleets depart from the observation deck of Aethara Prime, and felt the satisfaction of a being who believed he was watching the universe correct itself. He was wrong. The first sign that something was different came 17 days into the campaign, when Spearfleet entered the Calenthos Nebula in pursuit of what their sensors indicated was a retreating human battle group of approximately 200 vessels. Admiral Dreth of the Thessari commanded Spearfleet's forward element. 12,000 warships arranged in the traditional crescent of Dominion formation that had been the Conclave's standard offensive pattern for 9,000 years. And he was not worried, because nothing in his experience or education had given him any reason to be. The human ships fled deeper into the nebula, because retreating enemies were meant to be pursued and destroyed. And that was what the textbooks said, and the textbooks had never been wrong. Except they had never accounted for an enemy that wanted to be chased. The nebula was dense with ionized gas that disrupted long-range sensors. And by the time Dreth realized the 200 human ships had scattered into the cloud and been replaced by 600 stealth corvettes, it was already far too late. The corvettes were small and fast, and nearly invisible against the nebula's radiation background. And they did not fight the way the Conclave expected. They did not form lines, or hold positions, or engage in the kind of orderly exchange of fire that galactic warfare had been built on for millennia. Instead, they struck from every direction at once, appearing out of the gas clouds like predators emerging from tall grass, firing concentrated bursts at engine clusters and shield generators before vanishing again. The Conclave ships could even turn their weapons around. Dreth ordered his fleet into defensive formation, but the formation had been designed to face an enemy in front of them, not an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The battle lasted 11 days. 11 days of constant harassment, of attacks that came without warning and ended before they could be answered, of human ships that seemed to know exactly where every Conclave vessel was while remaining completely invisible themselves. By the time Dreth ordered a retreat, he had lost 4,000 ships, and the humans had lost 63. They called it the Maw of Calenthos, and it was the worst military defeat the Conclave had suffered in living memory. But it was only the beginning. Along the border, Hammer Fleet moved to blockade humanity's trade routes, and found something that no one had anticipated. The humans had already evacuated their border colonies, reluctantly, but completely and deliberately, stripping every world of people and resources and leaving behind empty cities and silent factories. And the Conclave admirals declared victory and occupied the abandoned systems, and congratulated themselves on a campaign of conquest that had required no fighting at all. The celebrations lasted until the traps started activating. Autonomous weapons platforms hidden beneath the surface of supposedly empty worlds powered up and began targeting Conclave supply ships, and orbital mines that had been dormant during the initial occupation suddenly came online and turned shipping lanes into killing fields. And communication relays that the Conclave had seized and repurposed began broadcasting corrupted signals that scrambled fleet coordination across entire sectors. The humans had not retreated from those colonies. They had turned them into weapons. Crown Fleet, the largest and most prestigious of the three invasion forces, pushed toward Earth with 30,000 warships under the personal oversight of Admiral Zeluing's most trusted commander. And for the first 3 weeks, the advance met almost no resistance at all, which should have been suspicious, but was instead interpreted as proof that humanity was already crumbling. Then the human tactical AI woke up. The United Stellar Commonwealth had spent decades developing artificial intelligence systems specifically designed for warfare. Not the rigid automated systems the Conclave used, which followed pre-programmed responses to pre-anticipated situations, but adaptive learning networks that could analyze an enemy's patterns in real time and generate counter-strategies faster than any biological mind could process. Crown Fleet's admirals discovered this when their carefully planned approach to the Sol system was met not by a static defense line, but by a human fleet that seemed to change its entire tactical doctrine every 6 hours. Formations that worked in the morning were countered by afternoon. Weapons frequencies that penetrated human shields at dawn were being deflected by dusk, and attack patterns that succeeded once never succeeded again because the AI learned from every single engagement and never made the same mistake twice. Crown Fleet's advance stalled, then slowed, then stopped entirely. 30,000 warships held at bay by a human force less than a third their size that simply refused to fight the same way twice. And then the broadcast started. Humanity's intelligence services had been intercepting Conclave communications since before the war began. Diplomatic channels, military orders, internal debates, private conversations between council members, and they had kept every single one. Now they released them. Every species in the galaxy heard High Arbiter Zaloon casually discussing the enslavement of an entire civilization over what amounted to a working lunch. And they heard Conclave admirals joking about how quickly the humans would break. And they heard council members debating not whether it was right to subjugate humanity, but merely how much of their territory to divide among themselves afterward. The effect was immediate and devastating. On Conclave worlds, civilian populations who had been told the war was a noble campaign of galactic security suddenly heard their own leaders talking about conquest and plunder, with the casual cruelty of predators discussing prey. And something shifted in the public consciousness of a dozen civilizations at once. On neutral worlds, species that had been content to watch from the sidelines suddenly began asking uncomfortable questions about what the Conclave had said about them behind closed doors. And on the front lines, Conclave soldiers who had been told they were fighting to protect galactic order began to wonder if they were actually fighting to protect galactic tyranny. 6 months into the war, the Conclave had achieved none of its objectives, had lost over 11,000 warships, had seen its internal communications exposed to the entire galaxy, and was facing growing unrest on its own worlds. High Arbiter Zaloon stood before the emergency session of the Council and declared that none of this mattered, that humanity was merely delaying the inevitable, that the Conclave's resources were limitless, and its resolve was unbreakable. He ordered the reserve fleets mobilized, doubled military production across all 12 empires, and declared that the correction would proceed regardless of cost. The Valesi ambassador watched from the farthest seat and sent a single encrypted message to the remaining members of the Conclave. It read, "We told you to count their wars. You did not ask the other question. Who won them?" No one responded. For 6 months, humanity had fought on the defensive, absorbing the Conclave's blows, bending without breaking, bleeding the ancient alliance dry, one ambush and one booby-trapped world at a time. And the galaxy had watched and waited and wondered how long a young species could survive against the oldest power in existence. The answer came on the 200th day of the war, when Fleet Admiral Rena Okafor stood before the Joint Command of the United Stellar Commonwealth and presented Operation Homecoming. It was not a defensive plan. The officers in the room studied the holographic display in silence as the Admiral walked them through it. And what they saw was not a strategy designed to push the Conclave back to its borders. It was a strategy designed to make sure the Conclave could never threaten anyone ever again. "We are not going to beat their fleets," Okafor said, her voice calm and precise, the way it always was when she was about to do something terrifying. "We are going to beat their civilization. We are going to take apart the machine that allows 12 species to control a galaxy. And we are going to do it so thoroughly that no one will ever be able to put it back together." The room was quiet for a long time after she finished speaking. Then the chief of cyber operations, a woman named Colonel Adaeza Mbachu, leaned forward and said, "When do we start?" "We already have," Okafor replied. The first blow fell on the Aetheron relay network. For 30,000 years, the relay network had been the nervous system of the Conclave, a vast web of faster-than-light communication stations that connected every system, every fleet, every government office across 12 empires in real time. And it was so old and so fundamental to how the Conclave functioned that most species had stopped thinking about it the way most people stop thinking about breathing. Colonel Mbachu's Cyber Warfare Division had spent the entire 6 months of the defensive war studying the network, mapping its architecture, identifying its weaknesses, and quietly inserting self-evolving AI constructs into its deepest layers like seeds planted in soil, waiting for the right moment to grow. The moment came at exactly midnight Galactic Standard Time on day 201. Every relay station in the network went dark simultaneously. 30,000 years of instant communication across a galaxy-spanning civilization simply stopped, and the effect was not gradual or manageable. It was catastrophic and immediate. Fleet commanders lost contact with their admiralties overnight, and military formations that depended on centralized coordination suddenly found themselves operating blind, making decisions without guidance, unable to confirm orders or request support, or even verify that their chain of command still existed. Governors of distant systems who had always relied on instant access to the Conclave's bureaucracy woke up to find themselves completely isolated, responsible for billions of citizens with no instructions and no way to ask for them. Trade networks that moved goods across thousands of light years based on real-time market data collapsed within days as ships arrived at ports that had no idea they were coming and left with cargo that no one had ordered. In a single coordinated strike, humanity had done something that no enemy in 40,000 years had ever accomplished. They had made the Conclave deaf, blind, and mute all at once. And they were only getting started. The ghost fleets appeared 3 days later. Humanity had been building them in secret for years. Massive carrier ships, crewed by no one, operated entirely by the same adaptive AI systems that had already proven themselves against a Crown fleet, each one carrying thousands of autonomous combat drones that needed no food, no rest, no morale, and no supply lines. They materialized in Conclave systems without warning, emerging from FTL at the edges of star systems and deploying their drone swarms before local defense forces even knew they were there. The drones did not target military installations. They targeted shipyards, fuel depots, communication arrays, and the orbital infrastructure that kept Conclave worlds connected to each other. And when local fleets scrambled to respond, the Ghost Fleet carriers simply jumped away, leaving behind chaos and wreckage, only to appear in a different system hours later and do it all over again. The Conclave could not fight what it could not find, and it could not coordinate a response with a communication network that no longer existed. And for the first time in 40,000 years, the 12 most powerful civilizations in the galaxy experienced something they had only ever inflicted on others: helplessness. Then the cracks became fractures, the younger species. Within the Conclave, those who had been brought into the alliance not by choice, but by the implicit threat of what happened to species that refused, began to pull away. The Veranthi stopped sending ships to the front lines, claiming they needed them for local defense against the ghost fleets. But everyone knew the truth. They simply did not want to fight humanity's war for the Conclave's pride. The Thessari ambassador quietly recalled half their fleet from Crown Fleet's formation, without informing High Arbiter Zeluin. And when confronted about it, simply said that protecting their homeworld took priority over a campaign that was clearly failing. And then the Cathari did something that no Conclave member had ever done in the history of the Alliance. They sent a back-channel message to the United Stellar Commonwealth, offering intelligence on Conclave military positions, fleet movements, and the location of strategic reserves. The message was simple and direct. Did not choose to be part of this. And we do not choose to die for it. Tell us what you need to know. Humanity accepted the offer without hesitation. But the weapon that hurt the Conclave most was not a fleet, or a cyber attack, or a defection. It was something far older and far more powerful. It was the truth. The USC's diplomatic corps launched a campaign that targeted not the Conclave's military, but its legitimacy, flooding every accessible network in the galaxy with translated human history, not sanitized or glorified, but raw and honest, showing both the beauty and the brutality of a species that had spent its entire existence fighting itself and somehow surviving. They broadcast human music and art and literature alongside detailed documentation of every species the Conclave had corrected over 40 millennia. Names, cultures, populations, fates, and the list was long, and it was horrifying. Species that the Conclave's own citizens had never known, heard of because their existence had been erased from official records. Civilizations that had been stripped of their technology and confined to single worlds. Entire cultures that had been declared incompatible with galactic order and systematically dismantled until nothing remained but ruins and footnotes. The message that accompanied all of it was simple enough for any species to understand. You are not protectors, you are predators, and we are not prey. On Conclave worlds, the broadcasts spread faster than any government could suppress them, because the relay network was down, and local authorities had no way to coordinate censorship across an empire that could no longer talk to itself. Citizens who had believed their whole lives that the Conclave was a force for stability and peace suddenly saw the bones buried beneath the foundation, and they were angry. On the Draelith homeworld, protests erupted for the first time in 3,000 years. Prime. The civilian government demanded an independent investigation into the Conclave's historical corrections, and was told by the military to be silent, which only made the demands louder. And in a small intelligence office on a Draelith border station, a junior analyst named Korath sat alone at his terminal and watched something his training had never prepared him for. It was a human cultural broadcast, not propaganda, not a weapon, just a recording of an orchestra performing a piece of music composed by a human who had been deaf when he wrote it. A man named Beethoven, who had lost the ability to hear the beauty he was creating, and had created it anyway. Korath watched the musicians move in perfect coordination, watched the conductor's hands shape the air as though pulling something invisible into existence, and listened to the music build from something quiet and tentative into something so vast and overwhelming that it seemed to contain every emotion a living being could feel. He was trained to analyze threats. He was trained to identify weaknesses. But sitting in that small office, listening to the music of a species his government had tried to enslave, the young Draelith analyst felt something that no intelligence briefing had ever warned him about. Not fear, not anger, awe. And deep in his chest, in the place where his people kept the feelings they were taught to never acknowledge, something whispered a thought that would have been treason if he had said it out loud. 14 months into the war, the Galactic Conclave was no longer a single entity, and everyone knew it, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. The relay network was still dark, and without it, the 12 empires that had once moved as one body, with one mind, had become 12 separate nations stumbling in the dark. Each one making decisions without knowing what the others were doing. Each one watching its borders shrink, and its people grow restless, and its leaders grow desperate. 3 species, the Varanthi, the Irvani, and the Brilliant Compact, formally withdrew from the Conclave in the same week. each one issuing a public statement that used different words to say the same thing. We did not start this war, we cannot win this war, and we will not destroy ourselves trying. The Thesari recalled their entire fleet and sealed their borders, declaring armed neutrality and warning both sides that any ship entering Thesari space without permission would be fired upon. Without hesitation, the Morhani collective fractured internally as 3 of its colony systems declared independence from the central government, citing the Conclave's war as proof that the old systems of authority could no longer be trusted. And the Cathari, who had been secretly feeding intelligence to humanity for months, finally dropped the pretense and announced an open alliance with the United Stellar Commonwealth, becoming the first conclave species in history to formally side with an enemy of the Council. Only the Drelith hegemony and its closest ally, the Soren Dominion, remained committed to the war, and even within those 2 empires, the cracks were spreading faster than anyone could repair them. High Arbiter Zeluin stood in the council chamber on Aethara Prime and raged at the empty seats where 11 other species had once sat, his voice echoing off walls that had not heard this much anger in millennia. But the galaxy was no longer listening to Zelun. It was listening to humanity, and what humanity was doing surprised everyone, including its enemies. Fleet Admiral Okafor had the military advantage, and everyone expected her to use it the way every conqueror in galactic history had used it, to drive straight for the enemy's heart, seize their capital, and dictate terms from the throne room of the defeated. Instead, she slowed down. Instead of racing toward Aethara Prime, she turned the bulk of humanity's military toward the forgotten edges of Conclave space, toward the worlds where the Conclave's oldest and darkest secrets were kept, the places that did not appear on any official star chart and were not mentioned in any approved history. She went looking for the corrected species. The first world they reached was Shoar 7, a planet in a system that the Conclave had classified as uninhabited for 8,000 years. It was not uninhabited. USC Marine transports descended through the atmosphere and found a world that had been deliberately cut off from the rest of the galaxy. No communication arrays, no orbital infrastructure, no spacecraft of any kind. Just a planet full of people who had been told for generations that the sky above them belonged to someone else. The Tenevari had once been a spacefaring civilization with colonies across 6 systems, and a culture built on communal storytelling and shared memory. And 8,000 years ago, the Conclave had decided that their culture was incompatible with galactic order, and had taken everything from them. Their ships, their technology, their history, their connection to the stars they had once called home. When the human Marines opened the sealed bunkers where the Tenevari's leaders were gathered, the aliens did not understand what was happening. A Tenevari elder, named Savi, looked at the human soldiers in their armor and their weapons, and asked a question that broke the heart of every person who heard it. "Which masters are you?" she asked. Because in 8,000 years, the only outsiders the Tenevari had ever seen were the ones who came to take things from them. Sergeant Major David Chen knelt in front of the elder, so that his eyes were level with hers, and removed his helmet so she could see his face. "We are not your masters," he said. "We are not anyone's masters. We came to tell you that the ones who put you here cannot do it to anyone ever again." Savi stared at him for a long time, and then she asked, "Is the sky ours again?" "It was always yours," Chen replied, and his voice cracked when he said it, and he was not ashamed. The liberation of Shoar 7 was broadcast across every channel humanity could reach, and the galaxy watched as a species that had been erased from history walked outside and looked up at the stars for the first time in 8 millennia. It was not the only world. Over the following weeks, the USC found and liberated 14 more corrected species, some reduced to pre-industrial levels, some confined to underground facilities, some so thoroughly subjugated that they had forgotten they had ever been anything other than servants. Each liberation was documented and broadcast, and each broadcast stripped away another layer of the fiction that the Conclave had been a force for order and peace. The Conclave had not been keeping the peace, it had been keeping a graveyard. On what remained of the Council, the response was chaos. The 6 species that had already withdrawn from the war issued formal condemnations of the corrections, several of them expressing horror that was genuine and shame that was long overdue. The Cathari released their own internal archives, revealing that they had known about the corrected species for centuries, but had been too afraid of Conclave retaliation to speak. And humanity did something that changed the nature of the conflict entirely. They announced the formation of a Galactic War Crimes Tribunal. The USC's Diplomatic Corps released a statement declaring that what the Conclave had done was not governance but systematic atrocity, and that every species responsible would be held accountable, not through vengeance, but through justice, through evidence and testimony and the full weight of galactic law. They called it the Reckoning Docket, and it covered not just the current war, but 40,000 years of what the Conclave had called corrections, and what the rest of the galaxy was now calling by its true name, genocide. High Arbiter Zaloon received the announcement in his private chambers on Athara Prime, and for the first time since the war began, he felt something other than anger. He felt fear. Not of humanity's fleets, not of their weapons, not of their AI or their propaganda. He feared what the Reckoning Docket represented, which was the end of everything the Conclave had built, the dismantling of a power structure that had endured for longer than most species had existed. And in that fear, he made the decision that would define the final chapter of the war. He descended into the deepest level of Athara Prime, a place that only the High Arbiter was permitted to enter, a chamber that had been sealed since before the Conclave was formally established, and he activated the Aegis Protocol. The Aegis was a weapon, the weapon, the one thing the Conclave had built to ensure that no matter what happened, no matter how badly things went, the Council would always have a final option. Its existence was the most closely guarded secret in the galaxy, known only to the sitting High Arbiter, and passed down from one to the next, across millennia. And it had never been activated because it had never needed to be, until now. Zaloon placed his clawed hand on the activation panel, and felt the ancient station shudder around him. Systems that had been dormant for thousands of years began to wake, and somewhere in the deep core of Athara Prime, something vast and terrible started to breathe. The charging sequence would take 9 days. In 9 days, the Aegis would be ready, and when it fired, nothing in its path would survive. Not fleets, not worlds, not the stubborn species that had dared to challenge the natural order of the galaxy. Zaloon closed his eyes and told himself this was necessary. He almost believed it. 7 hours later, the Valesi ambassador appeared before the USC's diplomatic envoy on neutral ground, and the ancient being looked different than anyone had ever seen. Its composure cracked, its dark eyes wide with something that might have been urgency or might have been grief. "He has activated the Aegis," the Valesi said without preamble. "You must reach the station before it finishes charging. You have 9 days. Admiral Okafor's envoy leaned forward. "Is the Aegis?" The Valesi paused, and in that pause was the weight of a secret carried for longer than human civilization had existed. "Come to Athara Prime," the Valesi said quietly, "and you will understand why we abstained." The largest fleet humanity had ever assembled jumped to faster than light on the morning of the 3rd day, and the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. 40,000 warships of the United Stellar Commonwealth formed the core of the Armada, their hulls painted with the names of every corrected species humanity had found during the Liberation Campaign, names that had been erased from history, now carried into the final battle on the armor of the civilization that refused to let them be forgotten. Alongside them flew 1,200 Cathari interceptors, fast and sharp, and crewed by pilots who had spent their whole lives pretending to be loyal to a conclave they secretly despised. Behind them came 3,000 vessels from the Voranthe, the Orvani, and the Brilliant Compact, species that had withdrawn from the war but had rejoined when they learned what the Aegis was and what it would do. And at the center of the formation, silent and ancient, and radiating an energy that made every sensor in the fleet hum with something that was not quite sound, flew 7 Valesi cathedral ships, vessels so old that their construction predated the conclave itself, ships that had not moved from their home system in over 10,000 years. The Valesi had finally chosen a side. Admiral Okafor stood on the bridge of the USC flagship Perseverance and studied the tactical display as the fleet approached Aethera Prime. And beside her stood the Valesi elder who had come aboard to serve as advisor for the final engagement. "You knew about the Aegis the entire time," Okafor said, and it was not a question. "Yes," the Valesi replied, and there was no apology in the word, but there was sorrow. "Why did you not tell anyone?" The elder was quiet for a moment, and then spoke in that voice like wind through ancient canyons. "We are the oldest species in this galaxy, Admiral. Older than the Conclave, older than Aethera Prime. Older than most of the stars your fleet is passing through right now. And in all that time, we have learned one truth above all others. You cannot save people from themselves. You can only be there when they are ready to be saved." "And we are the ones you were waiting for?" Okafor asked. "You are the ones stubborn enough to finish it," the Valesi said, and something that might have been a smile moved across that ancient face. The Battle of Aethera Prime began 6 days before the Aegis would finish charging, and it was the largest space engagement in recorded galactic history. The Dralith hegemony and the Soren Dominion had gathered everything they had left, 22,000 warships arranged in a defensive sphere around the ancient station, crewed by soldiers who knew this was the last stand of an order that had ruled the galaxy since before most of its current civilizations had learned to use fire. They fought with the desperation of those who had everything to lose, and for the first hours of the battle the defensive sphere held, Dralith dreadnoughts absorbing punishment that would have shattered lesser vessels, Soren fighter swarms pouring through gaps in the Allied formation and striking at exposed flanks. But the Allied fleet was not fighting the way the Conclave expected, because the Conclave had never fought an enemy that combined 40,000 years of Valesi wisdom with 300 years of human stubbornness, and a tactical AI that learned from every single exchange of fire and never repeated a failed approach. The Valesi cathedral ships projected energy shields of a type the galaxy had not seen in millennia, absorbing fire that should have been devastating, and redirecting it back toward the Conclave formation in cascading waves that disrupted targeting systems across entire fleet sectors. The Cathari interceptors dove through the chaos with a precision that bordered on artistry, exploiting gaps in the defensive sphere that their intelligence operatives had identified months ago. And the human fleet did what human fleets had always done. They adapted, they improvised, they refused to stop, and they fought with a ferocity that had nothing to do with hatred, and everything to do with the knowledge that behind them were hundreds of worlds full of people counting on them to end this. The defensive sphere cracked on the second day, shattered on the third, and by the fourth day, the remaining Conclave ships were falling back to Aethera Prime's close orbit, in a last desperate attempt to buy time for the Aegis to charge. They would not get that time. Commander Joaquin Reyes led the boarding team. 300 USC Marines in heavy assault armor breached Aethera Prime through a cargo bay on the station's lower hemisphere, cutting through blast doors that had not been opened in centuries, and moving through corridors so old that the walls were covered in the fossilized remains of languages no living being could read. The station was vast and dark, and full of automated defenses that activated as they advanced. Ancient weapon systems that fired energy types humanity had never encountered. Security barriers that sealed corridors and flooded them with toxic gas. And guardian drones that emerged from hidden alcoves with mandibles of hardened light. Reyes lost 40 Marines in the first hour. He kept going. The team fought their way down through level after level, descending into the core of a station that was older than human civilization. And with each level, the air grew heavier, and the walls grew warmer, and the sound of something breathing, something vast and patient and hungry, grew louder. They found the Aegis chamber on the lowest level, and they found the truth. The Aegis was not a weapon in any sense that humanity understood. It was not a cannon, or a missile, or an energy beam. The chamber was enormous, stretching out in every direction farther than the eye could see, and every surface was covered in pods, millions of pods, each one connected to the central power core by conduits that pulsed with light that was not quite light, and inside each pod was something that had once been alive. Neural tissue, brain matter harvested from sentient beings, kept in a state between life and death, generating the psychic energy that powered the most terrible weapon in the galaxy. The corrected species had not just been subjugated, they had been consumed. Every civilization the Conclave had erased, every culture it had declared incompatible, every species it had corrected out of existence. Their minds had been harvested and brought here, plugged into this machine, their consciousness trapped in an eternal half-sleep to fuel a weapon designed to ensure that no one would ever challenge the Conclave's rule. Across 40,000 years, billions of minds, still flickering with the ghost of awareness, powering a doomsday device built by the First Council as the ultimate guarantee of their supremacy. Reyes stood in the center of the chamber and felt his legs go weak beneath him. And around him hardened Marines, who had fought through every level of the station without flinching, stared at the pods and wept. "Commander," one of his officers whispered, "what do we do?" Reyes looked at the central console, where the charging sequence was displayed, 3 days remaining until the Aegis was ready to fire. And then he looked at the nearest pod, where something that might have been a face pressed against the transparent surface from the inside. "Broadcast this," he said. "Broadcast everything, every pod, every conduit, every face. Send it to every receiver in the galaxy, right now." The transmission went out unencrypted on every frequency the human communication systems could reach. Trillions of beings, across hundreds of worlds, saw it simultaneously. The Draelith homeworld, the Thessari colonies, the Morhani collective, the neutral systems, the liberated worlds. Everyone saw what the Conclave had built and what it had cost. On the bridge of every remaining Draelith warship, officers watched the broadcast in silence, and then one by one they powered down their weapons. The Soren fleet followed within the hour. There was no order to surrender. There did not need to be, because there was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to defend, nothing that could possibly justify what they had just seen. Reyes found Zeloun in the Aegis chamber, standing before the central console with his clawed hands hovering over the controls, as though he could still salvage something from the wreckage of everything he had built. The High Arbiter turned to face the human commander, and his compound eyes were wild with something that had gone beyond desperation into a place where reason no longer lived. "You do not understand," Zeloun hissed. "Order requires sacrifice. Civilization requires control. Without the Conclave, the galaxy will fall into chaos, and every species will turn on every other, and the stars themselves will burn with the fires of 1,000 wars." Reyes looked at the ancient insectoid ruler and felt nothing but exhaustion. "You built a machine powered by the stolen minds of entire civilizations," Reyes said, "and you are talking to me about order?" He stepped past the High Arbiter and shut down the Aegis. The station went silent for the first time in 40,000 years, and in the pods, the flickering consciousness of 1,000 consumed species finally went still, and whatever remained of them was allowed at last to rest. 6 months later, the galaxy gathered on Aethara Prime for the founding of the Galactic Concord. It was not an empire, and it was not a council, was not a hierarchy. It was a table with enough seats for every species that wanted one, with no chair higher than any other, and no voice louder than the rest. The corrected species that could be restored were given seats first. Admiral Okafor was offered the position of first speaker, the closest thing the new Concord had to a leader. And she stood at the podium where Zaloon had once pronounced humanity's subjugation, and looked out at the gathered representatives of a galaxy that was learning to breathe without a boot on its neck. "We did not fight to sit on your throne," she said, and her voice carried across the chamber, and across the broadcast networks, and across every world that was listening. "We fought because no one should." She stepped down from the podium and took a seat, not at the head of the table, because there was no head, just a circle with no beginning and no end. The Valesi elder watched from the gallery above, and for the first time in a long time, recorded memory, the ancient being smiled, a real smile, warm and tired and full of something that might have been relief, or might have been hope, or might have been both. The monument that the old council had commissioned to celebrate the correction was left standing in the main concourse of Aethara Prime, not as a tribute, but as a reminder of what happens when power forgets that it exists to serve rather than to rule. A human poet was given the honor of writing the new inscription, and she stood before the monument for a long time before she found the words. The plaque read, "Here stood an empire that believed it was eternal. It made one decree too many. It chose the wrong species. Now it is a lesson." Below it, in smaller letters, she added a line that was not part of the official ceremony, but that no one asked her to remove. "The galaxy does not belong to those who claim it. It belongs to those brave enough to share it." As the sun of the nearest star rose over the edge of Aethara Prime and filled the ancient chamber with golden light, somewhere in the back of the crowd, Sergeant Major David Chen stood next to a Tenevari elder named Savi, who had traveled from Shoar 7 to see the founding of the new order with her own eyes. The same elder who had once asked him which masters he served. She looked up at the light pouring through the windows of a station that had been a prison for 40,000 years and was now something else entirely. "It is beautiful," she said quietly. Chen looked at her, and then at the gathered species, and then at the stars beyond the windows, and nodded. "Yeah," he said, "it really is." And the galaxy, scarred and tired and finally free, turned its face toward the future and took its first uncertain step into a history that belonged to everyone.